Did Atlanteans live much longer than we do now? For example, the Sumerian texts refer to kings that reigned for many thousands of years.
Well, those are not Atlanteans, although Atlanteans did live longer in general. 120, 150 years is not uncommon for the Atlantean biotype. The Sumerian king lists have more to do with the idea of the Anunnaki and other extraterrestrial forms that did have, in fact, multi-millennial lives.
And were Atlantean aircraft balloon oriented, or did they use crystals to levitate or propel air, or by land or by sea?
It was kind of an odd combination of both in many cases. They did have lighter than air vehicles that were aided and assisted in their propulsion by the idea of vibrational means. So you could say, in a sense, that they used some of the science of levitation to move the lighter than aircraft around most efficiently.
And did the dinosaurs look the way we've interpreted them from fossils, or were they all furry or feathery or fluffy and just look like big animals and not terrifying lizards?
Well, again, some of them may have presented what to you would still be very scary appearances, regardless of the fact as to whether they had feathers and fluff, because they were still large animals, and many of them were carnivorous and predatory. So the idea is, yes, you are beginning to learn, as many of your scientists know, that many of them did begin to sprout the idea of feathers. Hence, those branches evolving into what you now have as birds. So the idea is still much of what you understand now in your modern times is relatively accurate, though you still have a lot to discover about them. So even though some of them may have had fluff and feathers, they still were formidable animals.
Okay, and can you talk about our moon and the origins of how it was created and came to be?
Your scientists are relatively accurate in the idea that the early Earth, when forming, was struck by another body in your solar system, and the moon, in that sense, was material that was broken off in the impact, and thus reformed as the moon around your planet in a natural way. Now, the moon is natural and formed that way, but it has been slightly altered since then because there are extraterrestrial bases on the moon and devices on the moon that have placed it exactly and precisely into the orbit it now occupies to help balance out your planetary system in a variety of ways. So it's not that the moon itself is artificial, but it has been artificially augmented to some degree. But originally, it is a natural body that was formed in the early solar system.
Was it in that sense moved so that it would be this exact size, like for eclipses and things like that, that
Yes.
it
Now we understand that the moon is moving and has been closer to your planet in the past, and it is still moving slightly away. Nevertheless, certain adjustments have been made so that at the timing that humanity would exist and at the timing it would be relevant for you, the size of the moon being where it is in position relative to the sun and your earth is not an accident.
So are there more advanced ET civilizations that know how to move planets in a sense and move things like the moon?
Absolutely. There are civilizations we have encountered that have the power to move stars.
And are they physical? Or does that require being a non-physical consciousness to comprehend that?
It does not require being a non-physical consciousness, but it does require a connection to non-physical consciousness to understand it in a very strong way.
Is it on a level of beings such as yourself, or would it be of beings that are even more advanced and higher frequency than you?
We do have the beginnings of the ability to do what we just said. but there are beings that are much more advanced that can do it very easily.
And does that also fall under the idea of terraforming planets?
Well, yes, that can be done, as was done for us. But terraforming a planet is not quite the same thing as moving a star for a variety of reasons.
Yes. And isn't there a thing with terraforming that it's not necessarily the idea that what is involved in terraforming a planet for species such as yourself? How did they terraform your planet?
It requires molecular adjustments on many different levels and fine-tuning with very advanced technology for the purpose of creating the atmosphere and environment that would be conducive to the expression of life planned to live on the planet. We cannot go into technical detail at this time. It is too large of a subject.
Okay.
But suffice to say, it involves an extremely advanced form of nanotechnological manipulation.
Well, just to take it a little further, did they bring animals to your planet, or was it more the idea that they they evolved?
Some were adjusted genetically and allowed to evolve. Some were brought to the planet and mixed into the ecosystem where compatible. But that's not the idea of physically terraforming a planet. That happens later when the planet has been terraformed and is ready to receive the idea of life.
So even higher beings are into gardening, is what you're telling us.
On scales so vast, it would try your imagination.
Wow.
There are literally gardens of stars, gardens of solar systems.
Wow. See, there's always more. Consciousness has that one thing going for it. Doesn't matter how long you exist, there's always more.
Yes. Though it is not something that we ourselves can do, there are also artistic arrangements, if you will, gardens of multiple dimensions. We have heard of this from those that have experienced it.
So at some level, this becomes one amazing amusement park, in a sense.
If you
The
wish to look at it
exploration.
that way, it becomes one expression of beauty.
Okay, if light and the absence of light is used to describe the essence of God, which has been used by many teachers, then what about the polarity of positive, negative, and the corresponding neutrality, and God being both positive and negative things?
Yes, it is. As we say, it's a trinity, positive, negative, and neutral in the middle. It's not really a duality, it's a trinity.
So the manifestation of at the of positive and negative is part of all linear reality. Is that correct?
Yes, and even some nonlinear reality, all the way up to all that is, and including it. Remember, it's a reflection. The only level that experiences none of it is the one that has no self-awareness. As soon as you have the all that is, that experiences knowledge of itself, awareness of itself, you have the reflections that automatically create the idea of positive, negative, and neutral. It exists on every level. It's not experienced the same way on every level, but it exists on every level.
So what happens to the parallel realities that we leave? Is there a version of a person and the people that they care about that are suffering when someone shifts to another parallel reality and apparently disappears?
No, because there are still things going on in that reality. It's just that your perception has changed. Your point of view has changed. You're looking through the eyes of someone in a different reality. But there is still always a version that is relevant for that reality that allows it to continue in the way that it needs to continue. It doesn't mean that every single individual always has a version of themselves in that reality. Sometimes they do appear to disappear, oxymoronically. But the idea is that whatever is relevant for that reality continues forward. Now, if someone leaves a reality in the way that you mean it, and someone in that sense misses them, and that's what you're referring to as suffering, well, that happens all the time in your reality anyway. When people cross over, they can be missed. You don't have to suffer for it, but you can recognize that they are no longer in your world in the way that they used to be. So that happens in your reality anyway.
And for this person's asking for clarity, source is both existence and non-existence. Is
No,
that correct?
no. Non-existence doesn't exist by definition. There's no such thing. It's a concept that you've created within existence, but there's not actually any such thing as non-existence, because by definition, non-existence doesn't exist.
And when you say wake up in the new earth, I expect myself to wake up tomorrow or after a nap, and everything will look different along with the presence of ET beings. Is that really going to be like a subtle shift with another layer, or is it just a completely different reality when that happens, or does that even happen?
Is always a completely new reality, whether you recognize it as such or not. Shifting through a subtle variation of different realities, one subtly different from another, doesn't mean that you're not shifting to a completely new reality. You're just doing it subtly over time as a process. So it can happen instantaneously, depending upon whether you eliminate the need for experiencing the process of shifting through multiple versions of Earth that are only subtly different from one another. It can happen instantaneously if you're willing to experience something or are ready to experience something that quickly. But for most of you, it will probably be a subtle process. But we simply remind you, any shift is actually a total shift. And when you actually wrap your mind around that more fully, then you might experience more of an acceleration in the way that you experience the idea of shifting. Because remember, it's something you're already doing. It's not something you have to learn to do. You just have to recognize what it is you're already doing. But you also have to allow, without insistence, the idea of any process necessary in that shifting that may be appropriate for what it is you chose to experience in your physical reality.
Okay. And a lot of people are having dreams about ETs. What are
Yeah.
some of the purposes of this proliferation of people having ET dreams?
Well, it may be representative of more contact taking place in the astral realm or spirit realm when you are asleep, thus as a precursor to the idea of open contact. It may also sometimes be memories starting to flood back into your mind of contacts you have already had, which again can also be a barometer that you're getting closer to open contact. So it can be either, and it can be both.
Back in the 1800s, did people dream about ETs back then, or is that
They did, but they didn't necessarily recognize them as such.
so
They
they
may
might thought they were
recognize them
spirits?
as spirits, they may have recognized them as elementals, whatever it is that they were using as a terminology back then, they did have those experiences, but they may not necessarily have recognized them as extraterrestrial beings, nor called them such.